Let us step into a world where history turned at a different moment, where the great tides of the Indian Ocean did not recede, but instead carried ships ever eastward into the rising sun. The year is 1433. In the Forbidden City, the air is thick with the scent of plum blossoms and the distant, earthy smell of rain on tile. The Xuande Emperor, seated on a throne of carved lacquer, listens to the reports from the Dragon Throne Room. The debate over the treasure fleets has raged for years, a silent war fought with brushstrokes on memorials, a conflict between the inward-looking Confucian scholars and the ambitious eunuch admirals. In our world, the scholars win. The colossal ships are recalled, the shipyards fall silent, and the maps are sealed away. But here, in this other stream of time, a different edict is issued. The emperor, perhaps swayed by a dream of jade mountains beyond the sea, or by the sheer, unassailable logic of Admiral Zheng He's final, magnificent report, decrees that the voyages shall continue, not with the same overwhelming scale, perhaps, but they shall continue. The order to dismantle the fleet never comes. The maps stay folded, but they are not burned, they are copied. And so the great treasure ships, the Baochuan, floating fortresses with 9 masts and vast battened sails like the wings of celestial dragons, do not rot in the harbors of Nanjing. They are repaired. New ones, sleeker and more ocean-worthy, are built in the bustling yards where the clatter of adzes and the scent of tung oil perfume the air. The mission shifts, subtly. The grand diplomatic tours to display the Ming's majesty to known kingdoms continue, but a new, quieter directive is added: to seek, to push beyond the charts, beyond the known routes to Malacca and Hormuz and the Swahili coast. The compass needles, guided by the mysterious Xipan, point steadfastly east. Picture this: the year 1441. A fleet of 5 ships, led by the veteran captain Wang Zhong, slips away from the monsoonal currents that bind Asia to Africa. They carry not just silk and porcelain for trade, but extra water cisterns, sacks of hardy millet and rice seed, and a cargo of deliberate curiosity. For months they ride the Pacific winds, a world of endless blue punctuated by the cry of albatross and the slap of waves against red-painted hulls. The crew, a mix of Han sailors, Muslim navigators from the Arab world, and carpenters from the southeastern coasts, live in the rhythm of the sea. They mend sails under a blistering sun, their hands calloused and salty. They chant prayers to Mazu, the sea goddess, as storms test the seams of their vessels. They barter with each other in a pidgin tongue that fills the long nights. Then, one morning, the lookout's cry is not of another squall, but of land. Not the jagged peaks of rumored islands, but a coastline of impossible scale, clothed in a green so deep it seems to swallow the light. The smell hits them first, even miles out, a rich, damp perfume of soil and vegetation, of a land that has never known a plow. They make landfall on a gentle, sandy shore backed by towering trees. Wang Zhong steps onto the beach, his boots sinking into the dark, soft earth. He picks up a stone, smooth and cool, unlike any he has seen. The silence is profound, broken only by the wind in the pines and the distant call of an unknown bird. He does not plant a flag. He builds a small altar of gathered stones and burns a single stick of incense, the smoke a delicate vertical thread in the still air. This is not a conquest, it is an arrival. News of this new land, which the sailors begin to call Fusang after an ancient legend, travels slowly back to the Ming court. It is met not with cries of empire, but with a measured, bureaucratic fascination. The land is not empty. Contact with the peoples of the western shores of Fusang, the Tlingit, the Haida, the myriad nations of the Pacific Northwest, begins cautiously. The Chinese traders, accustomed to the complex bazaars of Calicut and the royal courts of Java, find a different kind of exchange. They offer bolts of patterned silk, iron knives, and small ceramic jars. In return, they receive pelts of sea otter so soft they feel like mist, intricate baskets woven from cedar bark, and carved poles of red cedar that tell stories in a language of form and symbol. A trading post is established, not a fortress. It is built in a sheltered cove, a cluster of wooden structures with gracefully upswept roofs that seem to echo, unintentionally, the longhouses of the local people. The architecture is a hybrid from the start. Chinese joinery techniques using the colossal, straight-grained timber of this new world, sealed with local pitch. The men who staff it are not soldiers, but merchants, scribes, and a few agriculturalists sent to test the soil. They plant experimental plots of rice in terraced paddies beside the wild rivers, and they discover a local tuber, the potato, which they add to their own gardens. The exchange is quotidian, granular. A Haida carver learns to use a Chinese iron chisel, and the dragons he begins to incorporate into his totems have a new, sinuous fluidity. A Ming scribe, his hands stained with ink, tries to capture the complex sounds of the local languages in his logbook, creating a new script of borrowed radicals. We follow one such life, a ground-level story in this slow-motion encounter. His name is Lin Cao, a minor scholar from Fujian who failed the imperial examinations. Seeking a different kind of knowledge, he signed on as a record keeper for the Fusang outpost. His days are spent in a room filled with the smell of cedar planks and paper. He records the tides, the weather, the yields of the experimental farms. But his true work begins in the afternoons, when a Tsimshian elder, a man named Kwaku, comes to visit. They sit on stools in the dappled sunlight, a pot of tea between them. Kwaku speaks, using his hands to paint pictures in the air, telling of ravens stealing the sun, of the origins of the salmon. Lin Cao listens, his brush flying over the paper, attempting not just to translate, but to transcribe the rhythm, the poetry, the worldview. He is not compiling a report for the emperor. He is writing a book for himself, a book that has no name. In it, he realizes he is not documenting a primitive culture, but conversing with a civilization just as deep, just as complex as his own, but built on a different foundation, one of oral history and a profound kinship with the forest and sea. He understands, in a way no report could convey, that this land is already full. It does not need to be claimed, it needs to be understood. Back in China, the existence of Fusang becomes a known, but not yet transformative fact. It is another distant province, like Yunnan or Tibet, but one reached by sea. The flow of goods begins to alter the texture of life in subtle ways. In the markets of Hangzhou, alongside Persian carpets and spices from the Moluccas, one can now find cloaks of iridescent sea otter fur worn by wealthy merchants' wives, and strange, delicious smoked salmon, a novelty on the tables of the literate elite. The potato, hardy and productive, begins a slow, quiet conquest of its own in the marginal soils of northern China, stabilizing villages against famine. The scholar officials debate the Fusang policy. Some see it as a wasteful diversion. Others, a brilliant extension of the Tianxia, the all-under-heaven concept, whereby distant lands are harmonized through cultural attraction and trade, not military force. The decades turn like the pages of Lin Cao's now voluminous, unpublished journals. The outposts grow into small, permanent towns, with names like Xinanga, New Peace Harbor. Their character is uniquely blended. You can walk down a packed earth street and hear the clang of a blacksmith's hammer next to the rhythmic thump-thump of a woman beating cedar bark. The temple to Mazu has a totem pole standing guard beside its entrance, the sea goddess's image subtly blended with the features of a local ocean spirit. Marriage between Chinese settlers and indigenous families, while not commonplace, creates a growing community of mixed heritage children who are truly at home in both worlds, speaking a melodic Creole that carries the tones of Mandarin and the clicks and glottals of the coastal languages. The most significant difference from our history's European colonization is the absence of the great, terrible plagues. The trade routes across the Pacific are longer, slower, and less frequent than the Atlantic shuttle that would develop later. More importantly, the Chinese arrivals come from a vast, interconnected landmass, where diseases like smallpox have been endemic for centuries. By the 1400s, the population carries a degree of resistance. While illness is not absent, it never is when humans meet. It does not arrive as an apocalyptic, continent-clearing wave. The demographic balance remains, allowing for a more gradual, negotiated coexistence. Societies are disrupted, yes, but not shattered. Alliances are formed, often against common threats or for mutual economic benefit. The horse, introduced by later voyages, transforms the cultures of the Great Plains, but the process is slower, more integrated, like ink diffusing in water, not a flood. By the turn of the 16th century, the world map is being redrawn in the cartography shops of Seville and Lisbon, but from a different perspective. A Portuguese caravel battling its way around the southern tip of Africa finally enters the Indian Ocean. The captain expects to find the spice routes controlled by Arab and Venetian middlemen. Instead, he finds the orderly, overwhelming presence of the Ming trading consortiums. More startling are the maps he acquires. They show not just the coasts of Asia and Africa, but the entire western shore of a massive continent labeled Fusang, with detailed notations of currents, safe harbors, and even rough sketches of the interior. The world for Europe suddenly becomes much larger and much more crowded. The race is not to discover, but to find a place in an existing order. The closing of this chapter of our alternate history is not marked by a war or a revolution, but by a slow, inevitable settling. China does not dominate the globe in the sense of a vast territorial empire upon which the sun never sets. Instead, it becomes the central node in a global trade network that spans the Pacific. Silver from Fusang's mountains flows west to fuel the Ming economy. Ideas, crops, and art flow in all directions. The indigenous nations of the Americas, while changed forever, enter the early modern world not as conquered subjects, but as powerful partners in a trans-Pacific system, their populations intact, their cultures adapting but enduring. Imagine a world where the first lasting contact between the hemispheres was not a clarion call of conquest, but a prolonged, cautious conversation. A world where the sounds that greeted newcomers were not musket fire, but the careful barter of words and goods, the scratch of a scholar's brush trying to capture a new myth, and the shared labor of building a roof that could shelter two ways of seeing. The tides of history are turned not only by the crash of waves against warships, but by the soft, persistent lapping of curiosity against a foreign shore, wave after patient wave, until the very shape of the land is changed by understanding. Thank you for exploring this alternate history with us. The rain in Xinangang was a soft, persistent whisper, different from the torrential downpours of Fujian. Ling Kao, now in his 6th decade, sat by the paper lattice window of his study, watching it bead on the fronds of a giant fern just outside. The sound was a gentle percussion on the cedar-shingled roof, a sound that had become the backdrop to his life. His hand, thinner now, the veins like faded blue rivers on a map, moved steadily over a fresh sheet of paper. He was not recording the day's trade, the otter pelts counted, the bolts of silk accounted for, but adding a footnote to his translation of a story Kwaku's granddaughter had told him just that morning, a story about the orca and the moon. The room was a testament to a lifetime of careful listening. Scrolls filled with his precise Kaishu script were rolled and stored in lacquered boxes carved with both cloud dragon patterns and stylized ravens. On a low shelf sat a row of objects, a smooth, water-worn stone from his first landing, a small, exquisite basket of spruce root, a gift from a Haida weaver in exchange for a lesson in Chinese characters, a inkstone made of local slate that held pigment just as well as the Duan stone from back home. The air smelled of ink, cedar, and the faint, clean scent of the damp forest. His son, Wei, entered, bearing 2 cups of tea. The young man's features were a blend. His eyes held his father's shape, but his cheekbones, high and broad, spoke of his mother's Chimshin lineage. He moved with a quiet confidence between the two worlds, managing the outpost's trade ledgers in the morning and joining his maternal uncles in a salmon weir project in the afternoon. "The ship from Nanjing is delayed by the rains," Wei said, placing a cup beside his father. "The harbor master says another 10 days. Lin Kao nodded, sipping the tea. It was a local blend, incorporating dried berries that gave it a tart, floral note. "It is just as well. It gives me time to finish this chapter, the story of the flood. It has parallels to the tale of Yu the Great, yet the logic of it is entirely different. Here, the world is not drained by a heroic engineer, but reborn from the cooperation of all animals diving for mud." He looked up at his son. "When I first came, I would have tried to force the square peg of our classics into the round hole of their tales, to find validation. Now I see it is the shape of the hole itself that is fascinating." Wei smiled. "The administrator from the last ship still thinks you are compiling a dictionary for the Court of State Ceremonial." "Let him think it," Lin Kao said, a faint, weathered smile touching his own lips. "They receive their reports on crop yields and mineral surveys. They do not need my book of whispers." Beyond the walls of his study, the town breathed in the rain. In the forge, Master Zhang, whose own son had married a woman from the Nuchanoth people, was crafting a new design, a hybrid of a Chinese-style plowshare, but meant to be pulled by humans, not oxen, for the steep terraced gardens now common on the hillsides. The metal's scent, hot and sharp, mingled with the pervasive wood smoke and the salty tang from the drying racks where long crimson strips of salmon cured. In the communal kitchen, a woman named Li Xia was preparing a meal. In her pot, a stew bubbled, locally gathered shellfish, potatoes from her garden, and strips of venison, all seasoned with ginger she had managed to keep alive in a sheltered plot, and a kind of dried seaweed that provided a savory depth. It was a dish that would be unrecognizable in her ancestral home in Zhejiang, yet it was deeply, essentially of this place. The temple at the town's center was the most potent symbol of this blending. Within, the statue of Mazu, the celestial empress, gazed serenely from the altar, but the artisans, guided by local carvers, had given her a cape carved in the form of stylized waves that resembled the ovoid shapes of Northwest Coast art. On the temple's central pillar, a magnificent dragon coiled, but its scales were subtly patterned like the spots on a killer whale, and in its claws, instead of a flaming pearl, it held a perfectly carved salmon. Villagers, both Han and from the local nations, came to light incense, offering prayers for safe voyages, for abundant harvests from sea and soil. It was not syncretism born of decree, but of lived, practical need, a weaving together of spiritual comforts in a new and sometimes daunting world. This slow, patient weaving was not without its tensions, its frayed edges. There were conflicts over fishing grounds, misunderstandings born of different concepts of property and reciprocity, moments of prejudice flaring on both sides. But the structure that had been built, almost accidentally, was resilient. Disputes were settled not by distant imperial magistrates applying a rigid legal code, but by councils that included village elders from the Chinese settlement and headmen from the local clans, often meeting in the longhouse that stood not far from the temple. The process was slow, circuitous, filled with long speeches, metaphorical stories, and the sharing of food. It was governance by conversation, inefficient by the standards of the Ming bureaucracy, but remarkably effective at maintaining a fragile, precious peace. Across the continent, the ripples of this contact spread in slow, complex waves. The horse, arriving on the decks of ships that now made regular crossings, transformed life on the great interior plains. But unlike the sudden, disruptive cascade of our history, here the diffusion was mediated. The trading posts along the western foothills became exchange points where plateau and later plains nations acquired horses through established barter networks, alongside metal tools and new textiles. They had time to integrate the animal into their cultures on their own terms, creating a powerful equestrian tradition that was indigenous, not imposed. Similarly, Chinese explorers and trappers, mapping the great rivers, brought back tales of vast grasslands and towering mountains. These reports, filed in the archives of the Ministry of War, were read with interest but not immediate hunger. The empire's appetite for vast land-based conquest had been sated centuries before. The value was seen in trade, in knowledge, in the steady, manageable extension of influence. Back in the capitals of Europe, the discovery of this trans-Pacific world was a profound shock that recalibrated ambition. The first Spanish expeditions that finally reached the Caribbean from the east found not fragmented islands ripe for conquest, but outposts flying the Ming flag, engaged in a well-established trade for tobacco, tropical woods, and local crafts with the Taino and others. The Portuguese, pushing into the Indian Ocean, found the Ming consortiums too entrenched to dislodge. The response, after initial conflict and costly defeats, was a grudging adaptation. European kingdoms became competitors and sometimes junior partners in a system they did not create. They sought their own niches, their own alliances with indigenous powers, often playing a complex diplomatic game between local rulers and the distant, formidable presence of China. The colonialism that did emerge in the Americas was patchwork, contested, and forced to accommodate pre-existing powerful networks. The slave trade across the Atlantic never developed its horrific industrialized scale, as the economic imperative for vast plantation agriculture was checked by the abundant, alternative goods flowing across the Pacific and the stronger position of African states connected to the Indian Ocean trade. For Lin Cao, the grand geopolitical shifts were distant echoes, like thunder beyond the mountains. His world was the rustle of pages, the scent of rain, the faces of his family. On the day the ship from Nanjing finally arrived, he walked down to the harbor with Wei. The great vessel, with its distinctive crimson hull and battened sails, was a familiar sight, yet it always stirred a complex melancholy in him. A reminder of a homeland that now felt more like a childhood memory than a living reality. The new administrator, a man named Shen, disembarked with a brisk air of a bureaucrat on a mission. After the formal greetings, Shen was given a tour of Xinangang. He noted the hybrid architecture, the mixed populace, the strange temple, with a carefully neutral expression. In the evening, a feast was held in the communal hall. Platters of grilled salmon, steamed buns filled with a paste of local mushrooms and pork, and roasted potatoes were shared. Shen watched, somewhat bemused, as Lin Cao's grandchildren, their features a beautiful, seamless blend of continents, chattered in a fluid language that switched between Mandarin and the coastal tongue without pause. Later, in Lin Cao's study, Shen accepted a cup of tea. "Your reports on the local customs are remarkably detailed, Scholar Lin," Shen said, his tone polite but probing. "The ministry appreciates the diligence. But I must ask, for my own understanding, what is the use of it all? We have the trade figures, we have the maps. What value is there in recording their stories of birds and fish?" Lin Cao looked past him, out the window to where the first stars were pricking through the twilight over the dark, silent forest. He thought of Kwaku, gone these 5 years now, his voice preserved only in ink. He thought of the world outside, a world where two great streams of humanity had met not in a cataclysm, but in a slow confluence. "Use?" Lin Cao repeated softly. He gestured to the shelves, to the lifetime of work contained there. Administrator Shen, a man who knows only his own dreams, lives in a very small room. "These," he said, his hand sweeping over the scrolls, "are windows. They are windows opened onto a different sky. The ministry may have use for the timber, the furs, the silver, but the true treasure of Fusang is not in its soil, but in its mind. To understand how another people dreams the world, it does not fill the imperial coffers, no, but it reminds us that our way is not the only way. It makes the empire, in its soul, a little wiser, a little larger." Shen was silent for a long moment, his bureaucratic certainty momentarily adrift in the face of this quiet conviction. He simply nodded, unable to fully comprehend, yet sensing he was in the presence of a kind of achievement no imperial examination could ever measure. That night, after Shen had retired, Lin Kao stood outside his door. The rain had stopped. The air was cool and clean, heavy with the scent of wet earth and blooming night flowers. From the longhouse down the way, he could hear the deep, rhythmic beat of a drum and the rise and fall of a chant, a song for a successful hunt. From a nearby home, someone was playing a melancholy tune on a shao, the bamboo flute's notes weaving through the darkness like smoke. The two sounds did not clash. They intertwined, separate melodies finding an unexpected harmony in the vast Pacific night. He looked up. The stars here were the same as those that shone over the Forbidden City, yet they seemed closer, brighter, as if the sky itself were clearer in this new old world. He thought of the great treasure ships, the ambitious edict, the moment of divergence that had sent him here. It had not created a utopia. There was still hardship, misunderstanding, the slow ache of distance from one's ancestral land. But it had created this, a place where the first contact was not an ending, but a beginning. A long, continuous beginning, where history was not written with the sword's point, but with the brush's tip, the carver's adze, the weaver's strand, and the shared labor under a rain that fell on everyone, equally patiently helping the new, hybrid world to grow. Lin Kao took a deep breath of the fragrant air, turned, and went inside. There was still more to write. The conversation was not over. It had only